Okay. Tonight's program is entitled Kristallnacht and How We Survived the Holocaust. Before I start, I would like to thank Phyllis Goldblatt, Harriet Fold, and Glen Eagles chapter of Hadassah for their support of this program. Like tonight's event, many of Hadassah's programs are offered free of charge. However, some events require Hadassah to subsidize the program. If you are not a member and would like to join, or you'd be willing to make a special donation to Hadassah, Phyllis Goldblatt will be at the table, rear table, later on. Our program has two parts. Part one will feature firsthand accounts by people who were living in Germany or Austria on November the 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht. The second part, or How We Survived the Holocaust, will be a short documentary where you will hear from three people who survived the Holocaust. In January 1933, the German parliament appointed Adolf Hitler as its chancellor. 30% of Germany's workforce was unemployed. Germany's factories were operating at only 50%. Reparations for causing World War I were draining Germany's treasury. The world was in the Great Depression. Facing these and many other problems, Hitler decided to eliminate anyone who opposed him. He also proclaimed that the Jews are responsible for Germany's problems. During the next 6 years, over 400 decrees and regulations were issued against Jews. Jews were prohibited from holding civil service jobs. They were limited in participating in medical, dental, and legal fields. Jews were not allowed to share even a park bench with a non-Jew, let alone marry one. And all Jewish businesses were to be boycotted. Jewish children were prevented from attending public schools or colleges. Jews lost their right to vote. Jews had to sell their businesses to non-Jews for a fraction of their value. Jews could no longer attend cinemas, theaters, or sports stadiums. When Hitler took over in 1933, the population of Germany was 67 million people, with less than 1% being considered Jewish. 6 years later, about half of Germany's Jews had fled. However, unless they had moved to England, North or South America, their safety would only be temporary, as eventually Germany would occupy most of Europe during World War II. On November the 9th, 1938, violent demonstrations against Jews broke out in Germany, Austria, and parts of Czechoslovakia. Over the next 3 days, 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses and schools and homes were plundered. 91 Jews were murdered, and over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Firefighters on orders from the Gestapo stood by and watched as 270 synagogues were destroyed. This would mark the beginning of state-sponsored violence against Jews in Europe. Our first survivor, Hermann Heller, was 14 years old and living in Berlin with his mother and younger brother on the night of broken glass. Currently, he lives in Coral Springs. At 97, his ability to travel is very limited, so he could not be with us tonight. However, we will be able to hear his story via our video screen.
My name is Hermann Haller. I was born in Berlin, Germany, and in July 6, 1924. My parents were divorced early when I was 6 years old, so I hardly remember my father. But then the Nazi regime ordered that Jews cannot attend public schools anymore, so we had to attend a Jewish school. My mother had a furniture business in Berlin, and she managed the store till 1938, when there was the so-called Kristallnacht, November 9th. I had to have a big sign on the window with big letters to show that it's Sarah Anna Heller that was the owner of the store. So anybody could see right away that it was a Jewish store. And they said, do not buy by Jews, because the Jews are our misfortune. We had people that came in the back, from the back, you know, so they should not see that they go and buy by Jews. And we were discriminated. We could not go in the park. In the park, we had in our area, there was a huge park, a beautiful park. They had special benches in that park for Jews only to sit in that park. And then after a while, they didn't allow Jews at all to go into the park. And so every day they came out with new rules, new orders against Jewish people. Every day, this the Nuremberg, that was the so-called the Nuremberg laws. That's why in space after the war, they had the trials in Nuremberg, because that was where they made all those laws against Jews. And actually, not only against Jews, but against anybody that was against the Nazi regime. And like I said, then came Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was the worst. My mother was very concerned because she had a sister that had 2 little children. And they also had a furniture store. The whole family was in the furniture business. And where she lived, in the back of where the store was, there was a courtyard in back of it, and in that courtyard there was a synagogue. So my mother was very concerned about her sister. She tried to get in touch with her, couldn't get through with the telephone. So she asked me to take my bicycle and ride over to my aunt and find out what's going on. So anyway, I went outside. As soon as I went outside, I couldn't ride my bicycle because the street was all covered with glass, because they broke all the Jewish stores, they smashed all the windows, and down the street there was a synagogue on the first floor. And that building was not only the synagogue, but there was also people were living there in the building, so they could not put fire in the synagogue. So what they did, they took all the books, the Torah scrolls, and the benches and threw it out in the street and made a big bonfire. And it was a big mob outside, and they were standing there. There was police there, there was fire department there. And the fire department was pouring water on the synagogue over there to make sure that the fire should not spread to the adjacent building, part of the building where people were living. There were not non-Jewish people were living there. Mingled in with the mob, I found out that my aunt and the children were saved, that they were moved away to some neighbors in the neighborhood. They were not there. So after that, there was no way of opening the store again. And as a matter of fact, they made a decree that the insurance companies were supposed to pay for the broken glass. You know, my mother had insurance on the showcases and all. So, as a matter of fact, they had a meeting there with the big Nazi chiefs, what they're going to decide what they're going to do. So they decided that they let the insurance company pay, and then they confiscated the money and put it into the Reichsbank, into the German bank. In that meeting that they had about the insurance, they put a fine on the Jewish people of 1 billion marks at the time to pay for the damages that they did. And nobody could leave the country unless he had a paper from the Internal Revenue Department that he paid his portion of the fine. And after that, it was impossible to live in Germany anymore. So my mother had to make arrangements for us to leave.
I read an article that the Germans charged the Jews for the gasoline that was used to burn down the synagogues and the homes. By the way, did you notice all those newspapers were American newspapers? New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, Dayton. So the idea that Americans didn't know what was going on, somebody was reading newspapers back then. As you heard, getting out of Germany was all but impossible. However, Herman and his brother were able to get to Belgium, while his mother was able to flee to England. On May the 10th, 1940, Germany invaded Belgium and started rounding up Jews. Herman's brother knew a family that would hide him in their home for the next 5 years. Herman was not so fortunate. In 1942, he was captured by the Nazis. He spent the next 3 years in concentration labor camps. On April the 11th, 1945, American soldiers liberated Buchenwald, and he was freed. His story is available on YouTube. Just search Herman Heller, Holocaust Survivor. It's about a 50-minute video. And of course, I had to summarize in 6 minutes what you'll see in 50 minutes. He should be home watching this, by the way. Our next survivor, who is here tonight, was 10 years old on Kristallnacht and was living with his mother. And was it her brother or your sister? Were you living with your mother or your sister?
My parents.
Your parents, okay. In Frankfurt, Germany. His dad, well, anyhow, so let me bring up Werner Rothschild. And he is a member of that famous Jewish family. Just get close to the microphone.
Yes, I know. Thank you, Fred. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Good. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and November 9th, 1938 was the worst day of my life. As previously mentioned, 262 synagogues were torched, over 3,000 businesses and stores were completely damaged and destroyed. Over 30,000 men were taken to a concentration camp, and over 100 people passed. On November 9th, I was playing in the living room of our apartment building in an upscale part of Frankfurt when I heard a loud crash outside the building. I ran to the window, and across the way, another apartment building, 2 panes of glass on the 4th floor were completely crashed into pieces, and furniture started being thrown out of this apartment. Chairs, tables, plates, dishes, pots, pans, blankets, you name it, it was thrown out of that window, and it was a group of Hitler Youth and brown shirts that invaded this Jewish family and literally destroyed it. Needless to say, I was very terrified and afraid that this was going to happen to our family. Fortunately, it did not. However, 2 hours later, there was a knock on our front door. And when my mother answered it, there were 2 Gestapo men in civvies and 1 brown shirt asking for Dr. Sigmund Rothschild. Unfortunately, my father was home. They gave him 5 minutes to get a few things together, and he was taken to the police station in Frankfurt, where there was a huge yard where Other men already had been arrested, and they were made to stand there for hours before being taken to the concentration camp Buchenwald. Now, my father had been a historian. He taught at a Jewish secular school, history and geography. The school, the Philanthropien, was actually chartered in 1842 through Meyer Amschel Rothschild, whose sons, of course, became the famous banking family. Now, my father had also served in World War I on the French battleground and was wounded. And when he recovered from his wounds, was sent to the Russian front, where he was captured and eventually escaped and made his way back to Germany by the time the war was over. Now, my mother, who also was a teacher, by the way, taught English and French, now did everything possible to get him out of Buchenwald. She appealed to the Swedish consul because my father had gone to many conferences in Sweden and hoped that he could intervene. And also in his outfit in World War I was a young bum who constantly needed money for alcohol, which my father supplied. And this young bum became the head of the Hitler Youth. And she also appealed to him. Whether these appeals had any results, we don't know. It took almost 4 weeks before he was released. He was emaciated, he was beaten, he lost about 35 pounds, and took about 6 weeks before my mother got him back to his normal health. And as soon as he was able to travel, my father and my brother, who was 6 years my senior, who fortunately was not home when my father was arrested, otherwise he would have been also gone to Buchenwald. They left for London with 10 marks in their pocket, or $10, that's all they were allowed to take out. And now that left my mother and myself in Frankfurt, and my mother heard about the Kindertransport. Now, the Kindertransport came about through a British member of parliament who had been in Germany and had seen what was happening to the Jewish population. And he introduced an act in British parliament to allow 10,000 Jewish children to come, 7,000 from Germany, 2,300 from Austria, and 700 from Czechoslovakia. The first Kindertransport left Germany in December of 1938. And by the way, most of these children, by the way, when they left, went by way of Holland, where they were nicely received by many Dutch people who gave them cookies and hot chocolate before they went and crossed the English Channel. When they went to London, to a railway station where there was literally a meat market where both Jewish and non-Jewish families picked out these children and took them to their homes. 90% of those children had wonderful experiences. However, 10% were not so fortunate. The girls were made maids and they were taken advantage of and so on. I, as I said, left in March. My mother put a little tag around my neck. It said Hamburg. It had my name on it. And off I went as a 10-year-old boy, traveling to Hamburg. When I got to Hamburg, there were some Jewish young people that took me to the port. And there I was strip searched. They thought I would take maybe jewelry out or whatever. Anyway, I got to the ship, which I call facetiously my first cruise. It happened to be a United States Lines luxury liner, the SS Manhattan. And that went from Hamburg to Le Havre, France, to Southampton, and then to New York. Well, myself and 4 other boys got off in Southampton. We were taken to a youth hostel in Margate, which was a resort city 30 miles south of Dover. And we were in a 3-story building which housed 100 German Jewish boys. And it was one house removed from having an ocean or North Sea view. And unfortunately, the city of Margate did not permit us to go to school. They didn't want to spend the money for 4 classrooms or 4 teachers. And as a result, we didn't really learn any English, but we did a lot of davening. Anyway, at this point, a few months later, the war broke out. And we, being right on the coast, saw a few dueling air fights between Spitfires and Messerschmitts. And we unfortunately also saw merchant marine rowboats, sailors coming into the port of Margate, having hit a mine, and the ship was literally exploded because the Germans mined the English Channel. Anyway, there was not too much going on the first few months, but when Hitler occupied most of Europe, they were worried about an invasion of England, and so the whole youth hostel was moved to the northern part of England, comparative safety. I did not go with the rest of the group because at this point, my mother also had gotten out of Germany and went to London to be with my father. And before she left, though, she went to the city of Stuttgart, where the American consulate was. And there she stood in line for many, many hours to get a number. In order to come to the United States, you needed a number and you needed a sponsor, someone who would give the affidavit that you wouldn't become a financial burden. Well, the number that my mother received was 42,267. When you think about today, illegal immigration and people coming across the border, millions and millions of illegal aliens in the 30s and 40s, the State Department had a very strict quota, and the quota for Germany was 20,000 people each year could leave Germany to the States. So we waited in England until our number came up, and my father and I were the first ones to leave for the United States. We went, this is my second cruise, not as good as the first one, a 40-year-old tramp freighter, Furnace Line, which left from Liverpool in a convoy of 50 ships. Unfortunately, in that convoy was Charles de Gaulle and his Free French forces that had been rescued from Dunkirk. And so we left, first of all, the night before we left, the Germans bombed the harbor, but fortunately nothing happened. And we left and with a destroyer escort, and after 6 days of zigzagging, we still saw the coast of Scotland. It took 31 days for the trip from Liverpool to Boston. And when I arrived in Boston, when I saw at night, we arrived in the evening, and I saw lights all over Boston Harbor and Boston. I couldn't believe it, because in London, while we were there, we went also through the London Blitz. And every night the Germans bombed London. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, the air raid sirens went on. We lived in a little house and we went into the garden. And there we went into the Anderson shelter, which was actually 2 little sheets of aluminum. And underneath there were benches, and you sat there and waited until the all clear. Supposedly it was psychological that the aluminum panels would deflect any shrapnel from the bombs. Anyway, we're happy to come from Boston. We took a Greyhound bus, my father and myself, and we went to New York City, Washington Heights, where all the German Jewish refugees settled. It was actually called the Fourth Reich. There were so many. And today, of course, it's the Dominican Republic. Yeshiva University is literally surrounded by the Dominican Republic, mostly people from there. And my mother and brother, ironically, my brother, who did not get arrested in Germany, was arrested in England, because at this point, the English, understandably, were paranoid. with an invasion coming and rounded up all Germans, German Jews especially. They were all taken to the Isle of Man. And my brother, fortunately, was released when my mother got the tickets to come to the States. And of course, then we settled in Washington Heights. My father, who, as I told you before, had a PhD, got bad advice, and instead of teaching in a small college in the Midwest, not wanting to be a burden upon his sister, immediately took a job, the most menial job, at the Empire State Building in Longshore, the Longshore restaurant, as a dishwasher. So anyway, and I also, at 12 years of age, my cousin offered me a job because he had a job. And of course I accepted, and that job entailed, well, you know, paper routes. This was a very interesting route. We walked about 14 blocks from, well, actually, yeah, it was almost 3/4 of a mile at 5:30 in the morning. And we came to the 6-story building, and in the basement, this gentleman had huge cartons filled with fresh baked rolls that he must have received earlier, which he bagged and put into a baby carriage. And so when we arrived, we took the baby carriage and we had our route near the I remember every avenue on George Washington Bridge. But what it gave us also, since you couldn't ring bells at 6:30 in the morning to wake up the people, he gave us a little shoehorn, and every apartment building would be opened with the shoehorn. And for 7 days a week, we made the fantastic sum, which in 1940 was pretty good, $2.50, of which, because the subway was a nickel, the ice cream was a nickel, and so on. And I was very proud to contribute to my family. And that is the end of my story. Any questions? I'd be happy to answer the questions. Where? No. Any questions? Anybody? Yes, go right ahead. Yes.
You said you were 10 when you ended up in England. What was your thought? What did you feel was going on? And how did you feel about leaving Germany?
He was wondering, when you were 10 years old, what did you feel like when you had to leave Germany?
Well, I didn't have any choice, of course. I had a very normal childhood prior to November the 9th. I had lots of friends. I played a lot of soccer. And I had no choice. And I was happy to get out, needless to say, at that point. Yeah.
If you could just hold your questions, after the next speaker, we'll have a few minutes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
At this time, I would like to invite up to the podium Dr. Ronald Grant, who's a member here of Glen Eagles. Ron's parents were both born in Austria and were living there during Kristallnacht. Ron Grant.
Hi, friends. My dad's experience on Kristallnacht. My dad, born Hans Georg Gruner in Vienna, Austria in 1920, said that the beginning of the end was 1934, when the Chancellor of Austria, Dollfuss, was assassinated. Although he was a fascist, Dollfuss believed in Austrian sovereignty and banned the Austrian Nazi Party. However, his successor, Schuschnigg, sold out Austria to Hitler in 1938, the year Austria was annexed by Germany in the Anschluss. My dad could no longer go to school, the movies, restaurants, school, parks, or even take a casual walk outside. My dad's parents, my grandparents, Richard and Dora Gruner, could have left Austria in 1938, but my grandfather was convinced that things would be okay. After all, he was a pure Viennese soldier who was an assimilated Jew and had fought for the Kaiser. However, they must have been a little fearful about the future because they contacted my grandmother's brother, who lived in New York City, to get my dad an affidavit to emigrate to the United States. On November 10th of 38, my dad and grandfather were on their way to the travel agency to secure papers and book passage by sea for my dad. They were suddenly warned to hide in the agency since Jewish men were being rounded up nearby. This was the day of Kristallnacht in Austria. Hours later, they made it home safely, and a month later, an 18-year-old Hans boarded the RMS Queen Mary, the British ocean liner that saved hundreds of Jews from the Nazis, even as the St. Louis was turned away. Before he enlisted in the US Army and went back to Europe to fight the Nazis, my dad changed his name to George Henry Grant. He was part of the initial landing force at Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. He was wounded in combat in August of 44 in France, convalesced in a hospital in England, and then shipped back to the United States. He was then awarded the Purple Heart. My mom left Austria when she was only 15 with her brother and parents in December of 1938 on the SS Deutschland. Her brother and father were also hidden by a neighbor during Kristallnacht after being warned by a friend. My parents met in Washington Heights, where many European Jews settled after their escapes. And the phrase "never again" was drummed into me, and I now think we all have to relive and revisit that phrase in light of what's going on. Thank you.
Does anyone have a comment, maybe a personal experience, a family experience that would fit in with this topic, or any questions for our two speakers?
I would like to say something.
Yes, we want you to come. There's a microphone over here. Tam, look at your microphone so we can all hear. You gotta give me a microphone behind you. Right here.
Yeah, sure. My name is Fanny Korn. I have a long history in life. I was born in the Dutch Caribbean. I was born in Curacao to two parents who were Holocaust survivors. I lost two brothers in that time. I had a sister who since has perished. The DNA of my parents is in front of my forehead. I will never forget, not because I was there, I was not, but I learned and heard all the stories of my parents as I was a child on a Dutch Caribbean island. I lived after that in Israel for 6 years. My parents took me there. I served in the Israeli Armed Forces. I fought in the 6-Day War. And I would like to tell everyone here that it taught me a lesson. And the lesson is that not only never again, but every person who is of Jewish descent has the obligation to speak up for the fact that it's not just never again, but it can never happen to anyone of a Jewish persona in any shape or form. I was raised as a liberal, very global, wonderful, exquisite childhood. I am of every culture possible. But I have learned one thing, And then I was also, not that I interject, but I was also Hadassah president for many years and did a lot of fundraising for them. The point is that if you were born Jewish and you have the neshama in your system, you can never, ever forgive you can forgive because it's God's will, but you can never forget what you may be able to confront with ever in your lifetime. Besides that, we are obligated to the humanity of that era and forever, because Israel has fought many wars too. And never, ever, ever, ever not give up, and never, never, never not speak, because that was one of our failures. We never spoke, and we always thought we were very obedient and very respectful of other people. We should always speak up, because that's our weapon for anywhere in the universe. That
Thank you.
Israel Chai, we have a country, and that is what's important.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions for our two speakers? Yes, Phyllis.
I have a speaker for Mr. Rothschild. I assume that you've gone back to Germany. And I wonder what your feelings were going back.
That is such an interesting question. Thank you for asking that. The city of Frankfurt, I guess in order to forgive or whatever it may be, to repair relations, started a program where they invited 60 people who were born in Frankfurt, starting with the oldest. My brother went first. And when my turn came up, I told my wife, I said, look, we're not going to, first I wasn't going to go. Then I said, okay, we'll go. We ought to take everything they give us. It's free airfare. We'll go to Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt, we'll rent a car and we'll drive around, go to Switzerland and come back and fly back. As it turned out, when we got to Frankfurt Airport, we were taken into a room and there were other, of course, these people came from all over. They were born in Frankfurt. They came from Brazil. They came from Argentina, from Israel. And we were taken to this room, and the next thing we were given 300 euros and a schedule of events that were going to be taking place in the next 2 weeks. And I told my wife, I said, this is too good to be true. And they were really wonderful events. We're going to stay. We'll stay at the Frankfurter Hof, which was the #1 hotel, not only in Frankfurt. And interestingly enough, I was still able to read in German, and I was sitting in the Frankfurter Hof and looking at the Frankfurter Allgemeine, and there is an article about a man, by the way, the Frankfurter Hof, the only Jewish people that were there were the ones that were invited. And there I'm reading about a man who had been in Manhattan. He drove a taxi, he came back and got some money, and he bought one hotel, and the next thing he had a chain of hotels. And every Friday night he sits down with his sons and lights the Shabbat candles. This man happened to own the Frankfurter Hof. It's one of his chain. But anyway, when I got back to Frankfurt, Germany has changed. It changed completely. It was completely different. I spoke at a high school. The kids were fantastic. It was a different Frankfurt, completely changed. And as I said, not only did I go then, but later on, when they ran out of people that were born in Frankfurt, they took second generation. So my children went, and I went along with my kids. And again, it was just a marvelous experience. Fred and I attended last Sunday a March of the Living, Kristallnacht film forum, where they showed a beautiful film of a story of a I guess he was born in I don't know, in Austria, Germany, anyway. A man who went through several camps and experienced all the horrors of the camps, and eventually was able to somehow managed to be thrown through a train window and escaped. And anyway, the March of the Living, of course, is a wonderful program that takes high school students to the camps in Poland for a week and then goes on to Israel. And it was a fundraiser for actually the March of the Living.
How are you involved with it? How are you involved with March of the?
No, no,
Just tell me, we're here.
no,
You're not, well, you're,
no.
okay. It's a supporter of it though.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to ask Ron, growing up with your parents here in the United States, what kind of conversations did you have, if any, with them about their past?
Well, they shared all their, stories of humiliation and wanted us to reap the benefits of the wonder of the United States, and impressed upon us that it was important to live the good life and remember what their story was. And those of you that know me know that I spoke about my mother's life a few years ago at services here, and that's what we do.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. During the Holocaust, over 6 million Jews perished. Many others, through luck and circumstance, were able to survive. The film you're about to see will feature stories of 3 who did survive.